So I've been going through Matthew's Gospel and have, of course, divided it up into several sections based on what I think his outline is. And we're currently in his fourth section, which I have labeled with attention to these two sort of different responses to Christ, that Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. And pretty much end of chapter 12 through the middle of chapter 16 is generally where all that is. I think that is the contrast you see as we move through there. And we're really in the last half of this. We went through the parable section all together, and now we're moving through a section that's more story-based. And I've called these stories of disciples and doubters because, again, you encounter both people. You encounter Jesus with his disciples, and you see their faith grow. You also encounter people that are far more skeptical and opposed to Christ, and you just learn more about both groups, and you see Christ interact with both groups. Now, today's message is hopefully going to be an argument that every passage of Scripture is valuable because it's a very short passage, and it had its challenges trying to develop a whole message around it. And really, I didn't develop a whole message around it. This is like half a message because it's going to be pretty short today. But Matthew 14, verses 34 through 36 is where we are. This is just after the incident where Jesus is walking on the water. And so to resume the story, it says, "And when they had crossed over the sea, they came to land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick, and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well." So it's a very brief passage, 3 verses I think altogether, and in a very real sense, it only says what has already been said about Jesus. I mean, we've seen this kind of thing before. We've seen these kinds of summary sections before where it just kind of says, he shows up, he heals a bunch of people. You know, we've seen that kind of thing. And it would be very great to glance over it for sermon writing purposes. I wanted to fit it in with the prior message on walking on the water, but it just didn't work. So now it's by itself, and so we have to deal with it separately. The good news is this passage does have, I think, its own point and its own good point. I think it is worthwhile to consider this and give it its own attention for its own sake. And the summary sentence that I've developed for this passage is that these signs illustrate the future of people who are desperate enough for salvation. That's really what I get as I look at the details of this passage, and hopefully as I unfold these things a little more, you'll see those points come out a little more clearly. And I've called this message the Joy of Desperation because I think it sums up what you get when you get to a kind of state where these people are that Jesus meets here as he's healing them. So the Joy of Desperation. And really I only have 3 points, 3 short points to cover in this passage. But it's first of all that Jesus displays great signs. Secondly, that Jesus illustrates a great future. And then thirdly, that Jesus answers great desperation. So really those 3 things are the skeleton of the message today. And it will be very brief again, but I hope it's not a token message. I hope it's not just a message that I'm teaching because I happen to be teaching through an entire book of the Bible and I have to say something about these verses. I really think the verses are worth the ink that were used to write them. So I really hope we can give them our attention for 30 minutes and get something out of them that's helpful. That's what I'm going to try to do. So if you have the heart to open up your mind to these things, maybe we'll come out of this and we'll see something that maybe we didn't see before. But first of all, first point, this one the briefest of all, just that Jesus displays great signs. Now, again, healing, we've seen this before in Matthew's Gospel. You've heard this all before. Do we really need to cover it again? Well, there is one thing about this particular summary healing section that is worth noting. And to really understand it, you got to go back to the past a little bit, to an earlier point in Matthew's Gospel. And that one event, you see an event where one time Jesus healed one person without deliberate effort. One time Jesus healed one person without deliberate effort. And we find that back in Matthew chapter 9, sort of in the middle of another story. but we'll go ahead and read this. Matthew 9, verses 20 through 22. It says, "And behold, a woman who had suffered from a discharge of blood for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, 'If I only touch his garment, I'll be made well.' Jesus turned and seeing her said, 'Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well.' And instantly the woman was made well." And Matthew is very brief, as he very often is in some of these stories, but basically, the woman comes up and touches just the hem of his garment and is healed. And Jesus kind of realizes after the fact that this has happened and then assures her that her faith has made her well. I think Mark gives more detail on that story, but what Matthew records is good enough for our purposes. Now, it's great to, this is kind of an understatement, it's great to heal someone without even trying, right? I mean, anytime you do something without even trying, it's kind of like you give this half-hearted effort, but you did it anyway. You're like, I wasn't even trying, and now you look all great. Well, healing someone is great enough, but now Jesus, he heals someone in this passage without even really trying. He's just going through that crowd on his way to do another healing, actually, and this random woman touches him and she's healed. He wasn't even trying to do that. But that was one time, right? Just one time that Jesus did that. Because typically when Jesus heals people, what happens? They come up to him, they state the problem, he does something, he actually does something, even if it's just touching or saying a word that heals them, and then they're healed. He actually does something to make this happen. That's typically how these healings work. But this one time we see Jesus heal the person without even really trying. It just sort of happened. His power is so great, it just kind of came out in that one incident. Well, that was one time back then, but now in our passage, we see Jesus heal crowds of people without deliberate effort. It's not just one person one time. Now it's a whole bunch of people. It says that when they crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret, and when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick. So we have a good crowd here, and then implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. So you get this idea that the crowds are just kind of building around him. They're just kind of trying to get as many sick people to him as they can, and he's just walking through there, and they're just grabbing him, and they're being healed. It's a lot like what happened with the woman back in Matthew chapter 9, except now it's happening to crowds. What did just happen to one person is now happening to a whole group of people. And again, Jesus isn't even really trying. They're just touching him and being healed. So what was once a kind of freak display of power has become the status quo. What was done just one time, kind of a very rare event, is now being done to a multitude of people. So what you see here really is a growth of Jesus' power. And this growth of his power is, as I said, a great sign. And I'm calling it a growth of his power. Maybe a fresh revelation of his power would be better, but from an observer standpoint, Jesus is getting more powerful. I mean, there was a time when he didn't heal in that kind of nonchalant way. He actually had to do something. It wasn't just that easy as not trying. Well, now, in this very nonchalant way, he heals a whole region full of sick people. And there's a spike here in his power as it is displayed. That's growth, as I call it. And I think it is, in this part of the gospel, a very great sign. Because as we started to see, the opposition to Jesus has become a little more stalwart in their opposition to him. They become more openly skeptical. We have seen references to people who want to do Jesus harm. I mean, the pressure is mounting here. And you would think that that kind of thing would weigh down a person, maybe make them weaker, make them less able to deal with it. But instead, Jesus is actually growing in his strength. There are fresh displays of his power as it is being revealed. He actually is getting more powerful, at least by appearance. So it shows you here just how unstoppable Jesus is, that even as the opposition to him is mounting slowly, I mean, his power is just getting greater. So you see here a great sign of his power, and I wanted to bring that out because I think it's there in the passage, just based on the context we have with Jesus' other healings earlier in this gospel. Okay, so there's my first point. Now my second point is a little more indirect, so I'll have to spend some time weaving this out for you, and it's that Jesus illustrates a great future. Now the future that I have in mind is the age to come when Christ returns. It's the new heavens and the new earth, everything that happens after his return to earth. So that's what I'm thinking of when I say a great future. Now, to get there from this passage, I have to begin talking about a place called Gennesaret, okay, which is the place mentioned right here in this passage. Now, Gennesaret, I think, really is a significant location for this passage, and I'm sure when you hear the name Gennesaret, you are already thinking of several places in the Bible where Gennesaret is mentioned, right? Because it's such a well-known place. I mean, surely right now you have half a dozen passages in your mind. You're like, yeah, Gennesaret, I know that place. Seen a lot of stuff there. Can anyone name any? Close. That's the region of the Gerasenes. See? See what you're thinking of, you're not even thinking of Gennesaret. I mean, I expect someone to say that, by the way. It's close, but it's not there. Gennesaret never shows up in the Bible anywhere but here. I mean, it's never named. I mean, you have names that sound similar, but not Gennesaret. So, why would I spend all this time talking about this? Well, I figure it's important because these stories about Jesus very often don't give place names. When they do show up, it's kind of rare, especially in these kind of summary passages where Jesus is doing a whole lot of stuff and they're just kind of summarizing what's going on. But these locations, they don't show up very often, so I figure you got to ask the question, why bother mentioning the place? I mean, if it's just another set of healings, just another crowd of people, why bother with the place? Well, we actually do know something about this region called Gennesaret. We again have to thank the Jewish historian Josephus, who actually wrote a description of what this place was like. And it's a very interesting place. He describes it as being a very fertile place with a very diverse amount of plant life. He even says that trees and plants that usually don't grow well together grow very well together there. So you cross into this place, I mean, you're in the Middle East, not exactly the most lush place you can imagine, but here in this one region of Gennesaret, you have this very fertile place. It's kind of like the Garden of Eden of Galilee, if you want to call it that. That's the setting around us, okay? So when you're in Gennesaret, you're thinking of that kind of location. Now, based on that, I would like to resume a theme that I have mentioned before, that I did mention back when I talked about the feeding of the 5,000, but now we're going to kind of finish the story here, and that is this new Exodus idea that I have sometimes brought up, just the idea that the New Testament authors are portraying Jesus as bringing about this new Exodus for God's people. So let's just start here in Matthew. Let's summarize what has happened recently. Okay, here's what happened recently in Matthew. Jesus and the disciples cross the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so they're crossing a body of water. Then they come into a desert where Jesus heals and feeds 5,000 people. So they're out there in this desolate place, and there are these miraculous provisions of God going on. And then Jesus and the 12 cross the sea again. That's where we see the walking on the water. So again, crossing water. And then we see these mass healings again here in Gennesaret in this very fertile place, this very lush region called Gennesaret. So that's the basic storyline that has happened this recently here in Matthew. Now, can you think of any other biblical storylines which feature crossing a sea, time in the desert, crossing a body of water again, and then coming into a very fertile, well-watered, very lush land? Well, I hope you know your basic Israelite history well enough to know that we're talking about the Exodus and the conquest of Canaan, right? That's basically what happened. Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, okay? Then they come into the wilderness where they're there for 40 years. Then Joshua takes them through the Jordan River, to get into Canaan. And of course, Canaan is the land flowing with milk and honey. It's supposed to be generally this very lush place that God is going to give them. So that's basically that storyline. Well, the events you see recently here in Matthew, they're kind of a miniature version of that. And I did bring some of this out back in the feeding of the 5,000, but now we complete the story. You start off in this desert, you cross the sea, you come into a desert, cross the sea again, and now you're in this much lusher, much better place. Okay, lusher is a word, more lush, whatever the proper way to say that is. But that's basically what's going on here in Matthew. So you have this series of events that I think is taken up into this new Exodus idea, which means, if I'm reading that correctly, these healings in Gennesaret very much illustrate the great future awaiting God's people. What happens when we finally reach that place that God has promised to bring us? So to use the imagery of the Exodus again, God has already delivered us from slavery, okay? So sin and Satan and the fear of death and all of those things that enslaved us, God has liberated us from those things. And God has assumed the responsibility of caring for us as we live like wandering strangers in the world. I mean, we're very much outsiders in our culture and any culture that we go to, and God has taken the responsibility to care for us even though the rest of the world doesn't. I mean, so that's what God has done so far. Now, the one thing we're really waiting for is the fullness of God's salvation. Actually, to use the imagery, crossing the Jordan and getting into the promised land, these great promises that God has for us. And of course, when Christ returns, we'll have those things. There won't be any more wilderness, won't be any more sea crossings, don't have to worry about any of that. All we'll have is milk and honey. All we'll have is these blessings that God has been promising us. So these healings in Gennesaret, being the final point of this mini Exodus conquest image we have going on here, these healings in Gennesaret are kind of like that. When Jesus fed the 5,000, he also healed them, and there were healings there. But you don't get the idea there was anything special about those healings. I mean, it just says, and he healed them. So you get the idea that it was people coming up to him saying, oh, I have this problem. Jesus heals them, on to the next guy, kind of an assembly line type thing. But we reach Gennesaret, and it's more extraordinary. You just have Jesus, again, not really doing anything. Just like with that woman who touched the hem of his garment, they're just kind of coming up to him and touching him, and they're being healed. A more powerful display, more powerful than even in the feeding of the 5,000, which I said was the greatest miracle of Jesus' ministry. We come to Gennesaret and we see a display of healing even more powerful than what was happening in that time. That's how it's going to be in the future. We're going to see yet more displays of God's power in even greater ways than we've seen before. The work of God is going to be even greater then than it is now. The new heavens and the new earth will not be a letdown. We won't get there and say, oh, I thought it would be better than this. It's not going to happen that way. If you think forgiving sins was great, just wait until you see God eradicate sin. To all of your temptations and your struggles and all the stuff that you carry around with you that keeps affecting you in ways you don't like, gone. I mean, if you thought forgiving sin was great, wait until you see that. Or how about the peace in your heart? We put a lot of emphasis on that. Now I have peace within my soul with God. Well, wait until you see peace in the whole world. Every person brought into harmony by God. That's coming. And it's going to be much better than what you have in your heart right now. You're enthusiastic about having a relationship with God, right? And that's a great thing. Well, wait until you actually dwell with God. That's the promise, that God comes down to earth and remakes it, and his dwelling is now among men. All these things that we're facing in the future are so much greater than what we have now. Like Isaiah says, they're going to be so great that the former things won't even come to mind. All the stuff you've endured down here, not a problem anymore. It won't even come to your mind. It's going to be forgotten. And these healings in Gennesaret being where they are in this kind of mini Exodus routine going on here, and being so much greater than they were even than Jesus' other healings, they really represent that. They're kind of this brief glimpse of this kind of effortless power that God is going to use to bring grace to us forever. I mean, it's a very great picture of that. At least I think so as I was studying it. But now we have one more point here, and you can almost say this is sort of the entrance requirement for enjoying these things that I've been talking about, and that is Jesus answers great desperation. I say entrance requirement, but really it's an admission that you can't meet any requirements that there are. It's a sense of desperation. Now, these crowds, let's think about these crowds here in this passage. I would say that they are desperate for healing. Now, that would be in contrast to the kind of thing we've seen in other places where you have people that are maybe more skeptical coming to ask Jesus to do miraculous things. We've seen this before. Just to read briefly back in chapter 12. The kind of thing that we're going to see more often as we head through these stories of disciples and doubters. Chapter 12, verse 38. Then some of the scribes and the Pharisees answered Jesus, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it, except the sign of the prophet Jonah. So you have this kind of hard-hearted and hard-headed skepticism of the scribes and Pharisees. They're always pestering him for signs. Jesus has filled the country with signs, and they're asking him for more. And then they're going to ask for another, and another, and another. And they're just going to keep asking because they'll never believe. They just won't. I mean, if he showed them all the signs that he's been showing his disciples, they still wouldn't believe. At one point, I think in Luke, Jesus says that even if someone rises from the dead, which he was going to do, they still wouldn't believe. And they didn't believe it. They just made up a lie to cover it up. I mean, that's the kind of thing you usually see with Jesus' opponents. But you don't see that in Matthew 14. The attitude of these people is quite different. It says that they implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. So they implored him, they begged him. They came up, unwilling to take no for an answer, unable to take rejection in this way. They were imploring him. That's the attitude of this crowd. These people, I would say, they're desperate for healing because you only implore someone when you're desperate, when you need this. You're going to beg this thing of this person, you need it. I mean, they're not trying to prove anything, really. They're not trying to make Jesus jump through a hoop to prove that he's the Messiah. They're not trying to disprove anything. They're not trying to cut Jesus down to size by giving him a sign that he can't do. They're not really trying to do any of that. They just know they need to be healed, and they know that Jesus can do that. They have heard enough about him to know that he is a healer, and that if they're desperate for healing, they can go to him. And so they're imploring him from that attitude. They implore him because they're desperate, because they are sick people. Jesus encounters all kinds of stuff. There's blindness, there's leprosy, there's lameness, all kinds of stuff, terrible things. And these people need healing. And if you knew that you had an incurable disease and some miracle worker showed up, you'd probably be begging too. You'd probably get there as quickly as you can, have your friends take you if you can't get there yourself, and beg to be healed and refuse to take no for an answer. Even reach out and touch him in the hopes that even just touching him might heal you. That's the attitude you're going to have. And that's the desperation that we see in these crowds. Now, it is certainly a notable thing in itself, but there's another detail here we can add to this, and that is, and I'm going to do something visible here, the desperate crowds receive salvation. And I'm putting the quotation marks around it because I have to, just the way that I'm going to talk about this. You see the crowds in the Gospels, okay? I mean, the crowds are fickle. I mean, we know that. They're fickle crowds. They're here for healing one day. The next day they're going to chant for his crucifixion. And they're just not this steady, stalwart group of people that are loyal followers of Christ. They're just not. A lot of them are following the hype. A lot of them want the healings. They want to be fed miraculously, like in the feeding of the 5,000. You have all those kinds of things. Most of them not true believers. That said, Matthew does do something in this passage that is kind of interesting, worth bringing up and worth talking about. The Greek word that he uses here, where it says, as many as touched him were made well. Okay, made well. It's actually the word saved. I mean, the word you would see translated saved elsewhere. I mean, that's the word used here. So as many as touched him were saved. They received salvation. To use Matthew's wording, it's not my wording, it's his. So he brings in this word. It's a very loaded word, right? Salvation. It's, in a sense, it's what we're all about. We're the salvationists, as some people would have called us at one point in history. We're always talking about being saved. Well, Matthew brings in that word. And he brings it in this passage where we see people imploring Jesus for healing. They are desperate. I mean, they're begging him for this, and in result of their desperation, they receive salvation, to use Matthew's wording. It seems like Matthew brings this in here really to kind of make this point about salvation. What kind of attitude is necessary? I mean, what kind of person do you have to be? I mean, do you have to be especially holy? Do you have to keep all the 10 Commandments? I mean, what does it take to receive salvation from Christ? Well, really, to use this passage, all it requires is a sense of desperate need. To know that Christ has what you need, and to know that you have to go to him to get it, and that if you have to implore him to get it, that's what you do. But that's the attitude. It's an attitude of desperation. Coming to Christ is never casual. It's never an easy thing. It's never a nonchalant thing. Jesus can nonchalantly heal, but you cannot nonchalantly come to him. You have to know your need. Salvation is being rescued, right? Isn't that, we take this word and we make it so religious, salvation. What does that mean? What does it mean to be saved? It means you're in immediate danger. You're going to be totally destroyed or maybe seriously hurt, and then someone gets in there and stops that from happening. You were rescued. You were saved. Well, if that's your situation, how can you not be desperate? How can you do this? How can you go about this in some way that's just casual? It doesn't work that way. I mean, if if you were in like an airplane that was going down, right, and you knew there were parachutes, you'd be going for those parachutes. I mean, you'd be desperate to get to them. You'd be knocking down old ladies trying to get to the parachutes. I mean, you're desperate, right? Because you know you need them. Well, Jesus is like that. He's not an optional thing. It's not a casual thing. You know you need what he has. You know you need healing from him. You go to him. And if he seems at all resistant, you implore him. And if he keeps walking, you reach out and you grab him. And you hope that just grabbing him is enough. It's desperation. But it's that kind of desperation that got these people healed. I mean, they came out there thronging around him. They heard that Jesus was in town. Don't know how long he's going to be in town, but they know that while he's here, there's hope. So they got there, and they grabbed him if they had to. That's the attitude. Jesus answers that kind of desperation. And so I think Matthew throws that in as a kind of picture of what salvation is like. Are you desperate enough? I mean, do you want this? Is Jesus just kind of a cerebral argument to you? Just kind of this proposition, oh yes, Jesus is the Son of God. I have signed my name on the doctrinal statement. Or are you actually desperate enough to be healed by him in this way? It's not a casual thing. This great future that I mentioned, arriving there on the shores of this fertile place, effortless healing, this very wholesome image at the end of this small exodus, that's not for everyone. That's for people that are willing to trek out there and grab Jesus and not let go until they feel the healing come. That's what it's like. This passage does extend hope, but it extends hope to people like this, to the people that are willing to go out there and implore Christ for salvation and not let go until they receive it. It's better to be in a panic about salvation than to be calm without it. That is the great lesson out of all the things that I've said. I think that is the chief driving thing that I want to bring out of this. And, we could sit here and go in circles for another half an hour, but that's pretty much it. I think it's a great reminder of the proper attitude of the person who wishes to be saved. It's not about jumping through the hoops, but it is about realizing your need and letting that drive you to this desperate seeking of Christ. And that is as much as I can say on 3 verses. So we can take questions or comments if you like. Other than that, we'll just prepare for the meal. Are there any things that people want to say?